You're tuned in to 22 Crime, where the truth hides in the details. Together we dive into the darkest corners of human nature, exploring the mysteries that have left investigators puzzled and families searching for justice. Because in the world of crime, the truth is never as simple as it seems. This is the story of Gisèle Pelicot, a grandmother from a quiet French village whose life was shattered by an unimaginable betrayal. Her courage in the face of unspeakable harm not only exposed years of abuse but also sparked a nationwide reckoning. What started as a horrifying personal ordeal has now become a landmark moment for justice and accountability. The Mazan case isn't just a story about crime, it's a story of resilience, of courage, and of a woman who refused to let shame and silence win. It's about systemic failures, societal apathy, and the far-reaching implications when these elements combine. In this episode, we'll unpack the events that unfolded, the shocking details uncovered, and the pivotal trial that captured the world's attention. We'll also examine the cultural and legal shifts that this case has set in motion. So settle in, because what you're about to hear is more than just a story, it's a call to reflection and a reminder of the strength found in speaking out. The clock is ticking. Let's uncover the truth behind today's mystery. Viewer discretion is advised. 22 is a true crime podcast that delves into real-life crime stories, which often involve graphic descriptions, sensitive content, and strong language that may not be suitable for all audiences. We strive to present these cases with the utmost respect for the victims and their families. Please note that the content discussed may be distressing or triggering for some listeners. Additionally, all resources and information presented in this podcast are obtained from publicly available internet sources. Listener discretion is strongly advised, and we recommend that only mature audiences proceed with caution. If you are sensitive to such content, please consider watching another video. Stay safe and take care of your mental health. Mazan, a picturesque village nestled in the serene landscapes of southern France, seemed like the perfect setting for a quiet, uneventful life. For Gisèle Pelicot, a 72-year-old grandmother who had spent most of her life in this close-knit community, this idyllic setting was home. Little did anyone know, beneath this tranquil facade lay a nightmare that would soon shock not just the town, but the entire nation. The story began to unravel on an otherwise ordinary day in September 2020. Dominique Pelicot, Gisèle's then-husband, a seemingly unassuming retiree, was shopping at a local supermarket. To anyone passing by, he appeared like any other elderly man running errands. But that day, a security guard at the supermarket noticed something unusual. A black bag Dominique was carrying, suspiciously equipped with a small camera lens peeking out. The guard decided to observe Dominique closely. His instincts were proven correct when he caught Dominique attempting to film under the skirts of unsuspecting women in the supermarket aisles. Acting swiftly, the guard confronted him, and Dominique's device was confiscated. Authorities were promptly alerted, and what began as an incident of inappropriate filming soon spiraled into something far more sinister. What investigators found on Dominique's device marked the beginning of a case that would horrify even the most seasoned detectives. When police arrived at Dominique's residence in Mazan, their initial objective was to search for additional evidence related to the supermarket incident. But as they delved into his electronic devices, they uncovered a trove of videos and photographs. Thousands of files, meticulously organized and labeled, painted a grim picture of years of calculated and premeditated harm. The images and footage revealed acts that Dominique had orchestrated, involving Gisèle while she was unconscious. This discovery led to a deeper investigation. The authorities uncovered a pattern that had spanned over a decade. Dominique had been secretly drugging Gisèle with powerful sedatives, rendering her completely unaware of what was happening. During these times, he had invited other individuals to their home to commit acts that Gisèle could not have possibly consented to. The files included detailed logs, dates, and even messages exchanged with others, coordinating these horrifying events. The reality of what Gisèle endured was beyond comprehension. For over 10 years, she had been subjected to unimaginable violations, all without her knowledge. Her home, once a place of safety and solace, had been turned into a setting for betrayal by the person she trusted most. Dominique's actions were calculated. He went to extraordinary lengths to ensure his deceit remained hidden. The investigation revealed that he used online chat rooms to recruit others, creating a network of individuals who participated in these heinous acts. He would instruct them on how to approach their house discreetly, park far away to avoid suspicion, and refrain from leaving any traces of their presence. Dominique's orchestration was chillingly meticulous. And through it all, Gisèle remained unaware. She had trusted her husband implicitly, never suspecting the man she had shared her life with for over 50 years was capable of such betrayal. The arrest of Dominique and the subsequent revelations sent shockwaves through Mazan. Neighbors and acquaintances who had known the Pelicot family for decades struggled to reconcile the friendly, familiar figure of Dominique with the monstrous actions now coming to light. As investigators pieced together the evidence, the full scale of Dominique's crimes became clear. The files uncovered not only detailed his actions but also implicated dozens of others. Dominique's betrayal of Gisèle extended far beyond his direct actions. It revealed a network of complicit individuals, shattering the myth of ordinary men and exposing the dark underbelly of toxic masculinity in their community. It was at this point that the public learned about Gisèle Pelicot, not just as a victim, but as a beacon of courage. Her story was thrust into the spotlight, not because she sought attention, but because her strength and resilience would ultimately turn this personal tragedy into a larger movement for justice and accountability. The town of Mazan, with its picturesque streets and warm community spirit, seemed the unlikeliest setting for the nightmare that unfolded behind closed doors. Yet, within the walls of one seemingly ordinary home, the unimaginable took place, a story of deceit, betrayal, and calculated cruelty spanning over a decade. Dominique Pelicot, Gisèle's then husband, orchestrated a chilling scheme that turned their shared home into the site of unspeakable harm. His method? Substances carefully chosen to render Gisèle utterly defenseless, unable to comprehend, let alone resist, what was happening. How did Dominique manage this horrifying deception? He began by covertly administering powerful sedatives to Gisèle, typically mixing them into her food or drink. These substances were strong enough to induce a state of deep unconsciousness, leaving her completely unaware of her surroundings. Night after night, for years on end, Gisèle lived through this pattern without the faintest clue of what was being done to her. While Gisèle lay unconscious, Dominique's plans extended far beyond her incapacitation. He turned to the digital world to find others willing to exploit her vulnerability. Using online chat rooms, particularly a site known for illicit and morally questionable exchanges, Dominique presented a carefully curated narrative. He claimed that his wife was a willing participant in what he described as adventurous games, misleading these individuals into believing that their actions had her consent. The manipulation was calculated to the last detail. Dominique's instructions to these strangers were disturbingly precise. He advised them to park their vehicles far from the house to avoid arousing suspicion. He insisted they walk the remaining distance and refrain from wearing perfume or aftershave to avoid leaving any trace of their presence. They were even instructed to minimize noise, ensuring Gisèle would remain unconscious throughout the ordeal. In a sinister twist, Dominique used this elaborate ruse to lure men from diverse walks of life into their home. Among them were individuals from various professions, a firefighter, a nurse, a journalist, even a local DJ. The youngest of these perpetrators was in his 20s, while the oldest was in his 70s. These were not shadowy figures hiding in society's fringes. They were neighbors, acquaintances, and professionals living seemingly respectable lives. How could this go unnoticed for so long? The answer lies in the meticulousness of Dominique's deceit and the broader societal and systemic blind spots that allowed such atrocities to persist. He operated under the cover of normalcy, presenting himself to the outside world as a devoted husband and a well-integrated member of the community. Meanwhile, the harm he caused remained hidden, buried beneath the unassuming exterior of their household. One of the most harrowing aspects of this case was its longevity. For nearly a decade, Dominique continued his actions without detection. This raises pressing questions. How did no one in their close-knit community notice anything suspicious? Why did no one question the strangers frequently visiting their home late at night? The truth is, this silence was not accidental. It reflects a larger failure, a society conditioned to overlook warning signs, dismiss women's discomfort, and prioritize appearances over inquiry. It was easier for neighbors, colleagues, and acquaintances to look the other way than to confront the unsettling truth that something deeply wrong might be happening. And through it all, Gisèle was left in the dark. She began to notice unexplained symptoms, extreme fatigue, memory lapses, and recurring health issues. Yet, without evidence or context, she attributed these to aging or stress, never suspecting that the root cause was the person she trusted most. Dominique's actions, and the silence of those complicit, created a web so tightly woven that even Gisèle couldn't see through it. The revelation of these horrors wasn't just about Dominique's betrayal, it was about the role played by a network of complicit individuals. These men, hailing from diverse professions and backgrounds, willingly participated in Dominique's scheme. Their actions demonstrated a collective failure to question, to empathize, or to recognize the humanity of a woman who had been rendered powerless. This chapter of Gisèle's story is not just about the darkness that unfolded within the walls of her home. It's about the societal cracks that allowed it to remain hidden for so long. It's about the unchecked power dynamics that make such crimes possible and the urgent need to confront them. As we move forward, we will see how this story, once unearthed, became a rallying cry for justice, not just for Gisèle, but for countless others whose voices have been silenced. This was no longer just Gisèle's fight, it was a reckoning for a community, a country, and a system that had failed her. Courage often takes many forms. For Gisèle Pelicot, it meant transforming her unimaginable pain into a beacon of hope and advocacy for others. When Gisèle decided to waive her anonymity, she made a choice not just for herself, but for all those who had been silenced, shamed, or ignored in the face of similar harm. This decision to lift the veil of secrecy was neither easy nor inevitable. It was an act of immense bravery, fueled by a desire to reclaim her narrative and to ensure that the world could no longer turn a blind eye. Traditionally, survivors of such profound violations are granted the right to anonymity during legal proceedings, shielding them from public scrutiny. But Gisèle saw this right as an opportunity, not to hide, but to speak openly and unapologetically. By choosing to make her story public, she challenged deeply ingrained cultural norms that too often place the burden of shame on the shoulders of survivors. From the outset of the trial, Gisèle's presence was both commanding and inspiring. She stood tall, her head held high as she walked into the courtroom. Journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens who gathered outside day after day bore witness to her quiet strength. For many, her decision to open the trial to public scrutiny symbolized a seismic shift in the way society addresses these crimes. This was no longer a story hidden in the shadows. It was a moment of reckoning, brought to light for all to see. Gisèle's powerful speeches in court became a rallying cry. In one of the most poignant moments, she addressed the courtroom with grace and determination. "I wanted, by opening the doors of this trial, to ensure that society could see and hear what had been hidden for so long. Shame must no longer rest on the shoulders of victims, it belongs with those who perpetrate and enable harm." These words resonated far beyond the walls of the courtroom, sparking a national and even global conversation. Feminist organizations, human rights activists, and everyday citizens found inspiration in her call to action. They rallied behind her message, echoing her demand for accountability and justice. The decision to open the trial came at a personal cost. Gisèle was forced to relive her trauma in excruciating detail, facing not only her ex-husband, but also the dozens of others complicit in his scheme. Defense lawyers scrutinized her personal life, attempting to undermine her credibility and shift the narrative. Yet, Gisèle remained steadfast. In one memorable moment, she responded to a particularly invasive question with unwavering resolve. "Your attempts to discredit me only strengthen my determination. I am here because the truth matters, not just for me, but for every person who has been silenced." Her courtroom presence was more than an act of personal courage, it was a turning point in how such cases are perceived and addressed. By refusing to accept the role of a passive victim, Gisèle redefined what it means to seek justice. Her bravery exposed the systemic failures that allowed her suffering to persist for so long, and she challenged society to confront the uncomfortable truths it often avoids. Outside the courtroom, Gisèle's decision catalyzed a wave of public engagement. Vigils, protests, and discussions sprang up across France and beyond. Crowds gathered daily outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Shame belongs to them," and "Justice for Gisèle." Feminist collectives organized rallies, using her story as a platform to demand sweeping changes in how crimes of this nature are prosecuted and prevented. The phrase, "Shame must change sides," became a rallying cry, emblazoned on banners, social media posts, and even graffiti across cities. For Gisèle, this was never about vengeance, it was about accountability and transformation. She spoke not only for herself but also for the countless others who had endured similar harm in silence. In one of her most moving statements, she addressed the broader implications of her fight. "I think of the women and men around the world who have suffered in silence, their stories hidden in the shadows. To them, I say, you are not alone. Together, we can demand a world where justice is not an exception but the norm." Her words carried a profound message that her struggle was not an isolated incident but part of a larger fight for dignity, respect, and safety. In choosing to speak out, Gisèle transformed her pain into a call for action. She reminded us all that the path to justice often requires immense personal sacrifice. But she also showed us the power of collective solidarity, of standing together to demand a better future. The trial that unfolded in Avignon was unlike any France had seen before. Spanning over 4 grueling months, it involved 51 defendants, mountains of evidence, and a singularly brave woman who stood at the heart of it all. Gisèle Pelicot's decision to waive her anonymity had already transformed this case into a symbol of systemic reckoning, but the courtroom itself became the stage for a confrontation that would reverberate far beyond its walls. Let us take you inside that courtroom, a place where truth, denial, and the weight of unimaginable harm collided. The proceedings began on a humid morning in September. The historic Avignon courthouse, usually quiet, had turned into a hive of activity. A crowd of journalists, activists, and supporters filled the space outside, their signs and chants creating an atmosphere that was equal parts hopeful and somber. Within, the courtroom was packed to capacity, with rows of defendants seated behind their legal counsel. The charges were extensive, ranging from participation in orchestrated harm to various related offenses. At the center of it all was Dominique Pelicot, the man who had orchestrated the years-long nightmare. Flanked by his lawyers, he sat expressionless, his presence looming large even in his silence. The other defendants, a mix of professions and backgrounds, included a firefighter, a nurse, and even a journalist. They were not shadowy figures hiding in anonymity. They were neighbors, colleagues, and men woven into the fabric of society. The case against Dominique and his accomplices rested on a staggering amount of evidence. Thousands of images and videos, meticulously catalogued by Dominique himself, left little room for doubt. These digital files bore timestamps and identifiers, documenting years of calculated harm. They depicted not only the acts themselves but also the preparations, Dominique's explicit instructions to his accomplices on how to avoid detection, from parking discreetly to minimizing scents that might alert his wife. Each piece of evidence presented in court was a gut-wrenching reminder of the systematic and deliberate nature of the crimes. Yet, it was not just the digital evidence that made the case unique, it was Gisèle's unwavering presence. Imagine the courage it took for Gisèle to sit just feet away from the man she had once trusted implicitly, and from the 50 others who had participated in her suffering. Each day she entered the courtroom with her head held high, her resolve clear. When Dominique was asked to testify, his voice, described by those present as barely audible, filled the room. He admitted to his actions, but framed them within his own narrative, one of childhood trauma and supposed addiction. His apology to Gisèle was as distant as it was hollow. Instead of addressing her directly, he referred to her in the third person, saying, "I ask for forgiveness from this person, even though I know it is unforgivable." Gisèle listened, her silence more powerful than any outburst. When her moment came to speak, Gisèle approached the stand with quiet dignity. Her words were measured, her gaze unwavering. She spoke not only for herself but for countless others who had endured similar harm. Her testimony was not just a recounting of events, it was a declaration of her refusal to be defined by them. The trial drew unprecedented media coverage. French newspapers ran daily updates, while international outlets from the United States to Spain sent correspondents to cover the proceedings. Gisèle's story dominated headlines, and her decision to make the trial public resonated across borders. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily. Supporters held vigils and rallies, their signs bearing phrases like, "Shame belongs to them," and "Justice for Gisèle." The trial became a lightning rod for discussions about systemic failures, cultural attitudes, and the treatment of survivors in the justice system. It wasn't just the media or activists who took notice. Ordinary citizens, men and women alike, found themselves questioning long-held beliefs and societal norms. Fathers attended rallies with their daughters. Groups of young women brought flowers to lay outside the courthouse in solidarity. The collective energy around the trial signaled that this was more than a singular case, it was a call to action. The culmination of the trial brought mixed emotions. Dominique Pelicot received the maximum sentence of 20 years, a clear acknowledgement of his central role. The sentences for the other defendants ranged from 3 to 15 years. While every defendant was convicted, many sentences fell short of expectations, particularly for those who had already served time during pretrial detention. The courtroom erupted in applause when the sentences were read, but outside, emotions were more complex. Some feminists expressed frustration, feeling that the justice system had once again failed to fully grasp the gravity of the crimes. Others focused on the larger victory, that every man involved had been held accountable. The trial was not just about determining guilt or innocence. It was a mirror held up to society, forcing a reckoning with uncomfortable truths. It exposed how ordinary men could be complicit in extraordinary harm and how systemic failings had allowed the abuse to persist for so long. The trial also highlighted the power of public courage. Gisèle's choice to confront her past, to face her tormentors, and to do so in full view of the world, was transformative. It challenged a culture of silence and demanded accountability, not just from the individuals on trial but from institutions in society at large. The courtroom in Avignon may now be quiet, but the echoes of what transpired there continue to resonate. For Gisèle, for her family, and for all those who supported her, this trial was more than a legal battle. It was a declaration that silence and shame no longer have a place in the fight for justice. After 4 months of harrowing testimony, exhaustive evidence review, and emotional confrontation, the trial reached its conclusion. The verdict, delivered in the Avignon courthouse, would become a landmark moment in French legal history, but not without controversy. The judge's gavel marked the end of the legal proceedings, but it was the sentences handed down that captured national and international attention. Dominique Pelicot, the orchestrator of the harm inflicted upon his wife, received the maximum penalty allowed by French law, 20 years in prison. This sentence reflected the calculated, methodical nature of his actions, as well as his central role in coordinating the years-long abuses. In addition, the court decreed that Pelicot would not be eligible for conditional release until 2/3 of his sentence was served, a significant safeguard against early freedom. For the other 50 defendants, however, the sentences varied widely. The majority faced imprisonment ranging from 3 to 15 years, depending on their level of involvement and the evidence presented against them. A handful of these men had already served their sentences in pre-trial detention, effectively walking free after the verdict was announced. Others were given suspended sentences or allowed medical exemptions, adding to the public's growing frustration. The courtroom was divided. On one side sat those who believed justice had been served, satisfied with the convictions of every individual brought to trial. On the other side, dissatisfaction simmered, particularly among activists and supporters of Gisèle Pelicot. Many felt that the sentences, especially for Dominique's accomplices, did not fully reflect the gravity of their actions. The announcement of the verdicts was met with applause in the courtroom, but outside, emotions were raw and mixed. Supporters of Gisèle stood alongside feminist activists and other advocates for justice. Signs reading, Justice for Gisèle and Shame Belongs to Them were raised high, while chants of solidarity rang through the streets. Despite the crowd's visible support, whispers of discontent began to surface. For some, the mixed sentencing highlighted a systemic issue in the French legal framework. Critics argued that the punishment did not match the severity of the crimes, particularly for those defendants who received what many viewed as lenient sentences or were released due to time already served. Questions were raised about whether the judiciary fully grasped the far-reaching harm caused by such actions. We cannot call this justice when men who committed these acts walk free. Yes, we are relieved that every man was convicted, but where is the acknowledgement of the lifelong impact on the victim? Where is the deterrent for future cases? The trial did more than just deliver a verdict, it sparked a nationwide conversation about the broader implications of justice and accountability. Central to this debate was the glaring absence of consent as a codified element in French law. Under the existing legal framework, charges of misconduct or harm relied on proving physical coercion, violence, or surprise. For Gisèle's supporters, this highlighted a critical flaw: the law's failure to acknowledge the importance of explicit, voluntary agreement in intimate matters. Activists called for sweeping reforms, including the incorporation of the concept of consent into the legal definition of harm. France, unlike many other countries, had not yet embedded this principle into its legal structure. This omission became a focal point for critics, who argued that the lack of consent-specific language allowed perpetrators to exploit legal loopholes and cast doubt on survivors' accounts. President Emmanuel Macron, who had initially opposed changes to the legal framework, faced mounting pressure to act. Public figures, feminist organizations, and even members of the judiciary began advocating for a comprehensive review of the law. Proposals included redefining the criteria for harm to center on the absence of explicit consent, bolstering protections against chemical submission, and increasing penalties for repeat offenders. The cultural impact of the trial was equally significant. It forced French society to confront uncomfortable truths about attitudes toward accountability and gender dynamics. For many, the revelation that most of the defendants were ordinary men, fathers, husbands, professionals, was a stark reminder of how deeply rooted systemic issues could be. It also underscored the role of community silence in enabling such harm to persist undetected for years. The repercussions of the trial extended far beyond the legal system. Across France, rallies and marches became a common sight, with protesters demanding not just legal reforms but also cultural shifts. The slogan, "Shame Swaps Sides," became a rallying cry, symbolizing the shift from victim blaming to holding perpetrators accountable. Conversations about complicity, masculinity, and societal responsibility gained momentum. Men, too, began to engage in these discussions, acknowledging the need to challenge harmful norms and behaviors within their own communities. One of the most powerful moments came when Gisèle Pelicot herself addressed the crowd outside the courthouse on the day of the verdict. Her message was clear: this fight is not just mine. It is for every person who has ever been silenced, doubted, or dismissed. Together, we must ensure this never happens again. The trial's impact was not confined to France. Media outlets around the world covered the case, drawing parallels to similar systemic issues in their own countries. International feminist organizations rallied behind Gisèle, hailing her as a global symbol of resilience and defiance. This case became a tipping point, not just for France but for a global movement advocating for accountability, justice, and a cultural reckoning. The verdict, though imperfect, represented a critical step forward. It exposed systemic flaws, sparked meaningful dialogue, and inspired countless individuals to demand change. The Avignon courthouse may now be empty, but its echoes remain. The verdict was not just an endpoint, it was a beginning, a call to action for a society grappling with its own complicity and striving for a future where justice is not an aspiration but a guarantee. The trial of Gisèle Pelicot exposed not just the heinous actions of Dominique Pelicot and his accomplices, but also the structural and societal failures that allowed such harm to persist undetected for nearly a decade. This chapter explores how Gisèle's case became a focal point in the larger movement against gender-based violence and the systemic changes that advocates are calling for. While Gisèle's case is exceptional in its scale and visibility, it is far from an isolated incident. In France, as in many other countries, systemic violence against women has long been an underreported and inadequately addressed issue. Reports suggest that tens of thousands of women face harm annually, but only a fraction of these cases make it to court. Even fewer result in convictions. The barriers to justice are many: fear of retaliation, societal stigma, and a legal system often unequipped or unwilling to fully support survivors. For many, the ordeal of pursuing justice feels as daunting as the violence itself. Gisèle's courage in coming forward and insisting on a public trial shifted the narrative. By opening the doors of the courtroom, she invited the world to witness the systemic failures that her case laid bare. This transparency turned her personal ordeal into a lightning rod for a larger movement. The phrase, "shame swaps sides," resonated deeply. It symbolized a rejection of victim blaming and a demand for accountability, not just from perpetrators but from institutions that had failed to protect or provide justice for survivors. Protests and vigils held across France during the trial became spaces for collective mourning, solidarity, and anger. Feminist groups, grassroots organizations, and community leaders rallied around Gisèle, ensuring her story would not be silenced. Activist collectives like New Toot and other feminist organizations played a crucial role in amplifying Gisèle's voice. These groups used the trial as a platform to demand sweeping reforms. Their calls went beyond justice for Gisèle; they wanted systemic change. These activists highlighted the need for better legal definitions, more robust support for survivors, and greater accountability within law enforcement. They drew attention to the pervasive nature of violence and how it is embedded in patriarchal systems. One of the most poignant moments came when young women attending rallies brought their daughters, symbolizing hope for a future where such harm would no longer be tolerated. Chants of solidarity echoed through the streets. "We fight for Gisèle. We fight for all of us." Gisèle's trial exposed glaring gaps in the French legal system. Chief among these was the lack of a codified definition of consent. Unlike other countries, French law relies on terms like violence, coercion, and surprise, often failing to capture the essence of non-consensual harm. This loophole became a focal point for activists demanding reform. Advocates are calling for a framework law, a comprehensive legislative overhaul addressing gender-based violence. Inspired by Spain's groundbreaking laws on the issue, this framework would include clear legal definitions, incorporating explicit, unambiguous language around consent and expanding protections against chemical submission. Education initiatives, mandating education on consent, respect, and healthy relationships in schools. Training for law enforcement and judiciary, ensuring that police officers, prosecutors, and judges are equipped to handle such cases with sensitivity and expertise. Enhanced survivor support, funding shelters, counseling services, and legal aid for survivors. Accountability for platforms, cracking down on online forums that enable or perpetuate harmful behavior. One of the most urgent demands is for better resources to combat what activists call chemical submission, cases where individuals are drugged and harmed without their knowledge. Gisèle's case underscored how little is known or tracked about such incidents, despite their growing prevalence. The trial also ignited a cultural reckoning. While feminist organizations have long been at the forefront of this fight, Gisèle's case brought new allies into the fold. Men began engaging in conversations about accountability, privilege, and the role they play in dismantling harmful norms. Organizations started campaigns targeting men, encouraging them to examine their own behaviors and challenge those of their peers. This cultural shift, though nascent, represents a significant step toward addressing the root causes of gender-based violence. Gisèle's story did not stop at France's borders. Media coverage of the trial brought global attention to the issue, drawing parallels with movements like #MeToo and #NiUnimenos. Feminist groups worldwide hailed Gisèle as a symbol of resilience and defiance. Countries with similar systemic issues began looking to France as both a cautionary tale and a potential model for reform. The trial's global reach underscored that the fight against violence is universal. While Gisèle's case has inspired hope and change, activists warn that the road ahead remains steep. The systemic nature of gender-based violence means that true reform will require sustained effort, not just from governments, but from society as a whole. As we reflect on Gisèle's courage, let us also recognize the responsibility it places on all of us. Her story is a call to action, a reminder that change is possible but only if we collectively demand it. Gisèle Pelicot turned her personal struggle into a rallying cry for justice. Her case exposed the cracks in our systems, inspired movements, and sparked a cultural shift, but the fight is far from over. Together, we must ensure her bravery was not in vain, and that no survivor ever feels alone again. Gisèle Pelicot entered the public eye as a victim of unimaginable harm, but she emerged as something much greater, a symbol of defiance, resilience, and empowerment. In this chapter, we explore how Gisèle's bravery transformed her into a global icon and how her story has inspired countless individuals to confront injustices and pursue change. Before the trial, Gisèle led a quiet life in Mazan, a small town in the south of France. Known as a devoted mother and grandmother, she cherished her family and community. But beneath the surface, she endured a nightmare orchestrated by the person she trusted most. When the truth came to light, Gisèle faced a critical choice: to remain in the shadows or to step forward and let the world see the truth. Gisèle made the courageous decision to waive her anonymity, opening herself up to public scrutiny and criticism. She chose not to hide behind the shame that society often places on survivors, but instead to challenge it head-on. It was a moment that shifted the narrative, not just in her case, but for survivors everywhere. Her decision to hold a public trial ensured that the broader issues surrounding her case could not be ignored. By sharing her story, Gisèle gave voice to countless others who have endured similar pain in silence. As the trial unfolded, Gisèle's strength captivated audiences far beyond France. Her story was reported by media outlets worldwide, sparking discussions about justice, accountability, and the pervasive issue of gender-based violence. She became a rallying point for feminist movements across the globe. Gisèle's insistence that shame swaps sides resonated deeply with individuals and communities. The phrase became a clarion call, urging society to shift the burden of guilt from survivors to perpetrators. Women from all walks of life began to share their own stories, inspired by Gisèle's courage. From protests in France to social media campaigns in distant countries, her name became synonymous with resilience. Activists pointed to her as proof that change is possible, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. When the trial concluded, Gisèle faced the daunting task of rebuilding her life. Years of pain, betrayal, and public exposure had taken their toll, but she remained steadfast in her commitment to creating a better future, not just for herself, but for others. After the trial, Gisèle expressed her gratitude to the countless supporters who stood by her. She described their encouragement as the force that kept her going during the darkest moments. But as she stepped out of the courtroom, she also made it clear that her fight was far from over. Gisèle has since dedicated herself to advocating for systemic changes to protect others from experiencing what she endured. She has become a voice for reform, pushing for comprehensive legislation, better resources for survivors, and societal shifts in how harm is perceived and addressed. Gisèle's story resonated particularly strongly with women who had long felt powerless. Her unwavering resolve reminded them that they too could demand accountability and pursue justice. From grassroots movements to high-profile campaigns, her influence continues to inspire action. Gisèle's transformation from a private individual to a global icon underscores the power of one person's courage. Her defiance in the face of adversity shattered stereotypes about survivors and forced society to confront uncomfortable truths. She became a symbol of what it means to turn pain into purpose. One poignant moment came when young women at a rally in France carried signs that read, "For Gisèle, for us, for everyone." It was a reminder that her fight was not just her own but part of a collective struggle for equity and justice. As she moves forward, Gisèle has expressed her hopes for a more equitable world. She envisions a society where survivors are believed and supported, where harm is not normalized or ignored, and where education fosters understanding and respect. Gisèle's aspirations extend beyond her own healing. She dreams of a future where her grandchildren and all future generations will live in a world free from harm. Her message is one of hope, resilience, and the belief that meaningful change is within reach. Gisèle Pelicot's journey is far from over, but her legacy is already being felt. She has become a symbol of what it means to fight for justice, not just for oneself, but for others. Her story serves as a reminder that even in the face of immense darkness, one voice can ignite a movement. Gisèle taught us that resilience is not just about surviving, it's about thriving, advocating, and inspiring. Her courage has illuminated a path forward for countless individuals, and her legacy will continue to shape the fight for justice and equality for years to come. As we come to the end of this story, we are left with much to reflect on. The case of Gisèle Pelicot and the events that unfolded in Mazan are not just about one woman's courage or the justice delivered in a courtroom. They are a mirror held up to our society, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, trust, and accountability. The Mazan case will undoubtedly be remembered as a pivotal moment in history, a moment when a single individual's determination reshaped societal perceptions. Gisèle's story, harrowing as it is, serves as a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. It compels us to recognize the importance of standing together against injustices and amplifying the voices of those who have been silenced. This case also highlights the necessity for systemic changes. Justice is not merely about convicting perpetrators, it is about ensuring that our legal systems, our cultures, and our institutions evolve to protect everyone, especially the most vulnerable. The Mazan case exposed the cracks in the system, but it also opened the door to meaningful reform. The enduring lessons of this case are clear. First, harm thrives in silence, secrecy, and complicity. The courage to speak out is the first step in dismantling that silence. Second, accountability must be collective. It is not enough for individuals to bear the weight of seeking justice. Communities, governments, and institutions must share in this responsibility. Perhaps one of the most profound lessons is the necessity of education. The Mazan case revealed not just the acts of individuals but the underlying societal attitudes that enable such harm. Through awareness, dialogue, and education, we can challenge and change these attitudes, creating a culture where respect and consent are foundational. Gisèle's courage reminds us that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can shine brightest. Her decision to waive her anonymity, to open the doors of the trial, and to share her story was not just an act of bravery, it was a beacon of hope for others. It was a statement that no one should face their struggles alone. Her fight was not just about her own justice. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what she did without the support and acknowledgement they deserve. Gisèle's story is a testament to the power of resilience, and it challenges us all to ask, what can we do to stand with those who are fighting their own battles? While the trial is over, the work it inspired is far from complete. There are still questions to be answered, laws to be changed, and hearts to be transformed. This case has sparked global conversations, but its true impact will depend on the actions we take moving forward. Let this story remind us of the strength that comes from unity. Whether it is standing in solidarity with survivors, advocating for legal reform, or simply educating ourselves and those around us, each step we take contributes to a brighter, safer future. As we close this chapter, we invite you to reflect on what this case means to you. Think about the courage it took for Gisèle to share her story, the resilience of her spirit, and the collective power of those who stood with her. How can we take these lessons and apply them in our own lives and communities? The story of Mazan is not just about the past. It is about the future we want to build, a future where harm has no place, where silence is broken, and where justice prevails. Thank you so much for listening all the way through. If you've made it to this point, drop a comment with the word "done," and we'll give you a personal shout-out to show our appreciation. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive in this murder and media frenzy. It was as fascinating for us to create as we hope it was for you to hear. If you found this episode thought-provoking, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We also invite you to join our YouTube channel, where you can get early access to our content, have your questions answered directly, and enjoy exclusive members-only content. We'd love to know what you think about this case. Was justice truly served? Share your opinions in the comments below. We're always eager to hear your thoughts. For those wanting to explore more on true crime, we've included Amazon affiliate links to some of the books we referenced in our researches. Purchasing through the link won't cost you anything extra, but it will support the channel and help us continue bringing you more content. If you're craving even more, consider joining our Patreon community. As a member, you'll get access to the full script of this episode, exclusive book summaries, and even the complete set of images featured in this case, available for purchase in our Patreon store. This has been 22 Crime. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.